want to acknowledge that Raj, Maria and I are zooming into you today from Gubbi Gubbi country on the beautiful Sunshine Coast, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I acknowledge that Shireen is joining us from South African land. In Australia, the lands were never ceded, and so this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I think there's never been a more important time to remember this. This is a space of age-old ceremony, wisdom and education, and I hope that this rich history and ongoing cultural dynamism will infuse our discussions today. And I acknowledge all of the over 250 First Nations across the land now known as Australia. So Shireen, over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to see if I get this right. Sorry, I did have the... Okay. I might just need some help here because I'm used to using the Teams. I've forgotten how to do it on the Zoom. So you just go to share screen and share, basically.
That's right, yes. But sometimes you have to go back to your original document that you want to share because it may not appear on the display.
Okay, I'm doing that. My apologies for this. Just got a bit... I see my neighbors are also complaining that everybody's Wi-Fi is down. So it seems as though you're in that situation today. Just trying to find this.
Yes, it starts there. Yep.
Is it there?
Yes, it's
great.
There. And if you just turn it into the presentation mode.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Beginning. Okay, great.
Perfect.
So thanks, colleagues. Great to be with the Australian colleagues. And clearly we are meeting at a time when there's turmoil in the world and a lot of suffering and a lot of humanitarian crises. Just want to acknowledge the moment we're in as well. So my presentation today is entitled The Hill We Climb in Search of a New Pedagogy. And it is based on a poem by Amanda Gorman, who spoke at one of the last president's departing speeches when President Obama left. But it's a very relevant poem to us today as well. So the paper covers 3 aspects. We look at the theoretical framework, we look at pedagogy during COVID-19, and then all the discussion seems to have shifted to the future-focused university and pedagogy. So during COVID-19, there was a lot of discussion about where we can go to at that moment, and it seemed as though our traditional pedagogies that we worked with were not adequate in coping with that crisis moment, and new pedagogies came into place, including the pedagogy of emplacement, the pedagogy of the mundane, the pedagogy of deep engagement, and most importantly, the pedagogies of care and empathy. I think the big question that we all faced and that the pandemic moment reinforced for us was a question that I think faces universities universally and at all times, but in some ways the focus was sharpened during the time of COVID-19, was can pedagogies of equity, dignity, and justice emerge during this crisis moment? And are our universities pedagogically constructed for online teaching and learning if this is indeed the new normal? I don't know what it was like in Australia, but in South Africa, certainly there were huge debates that went on. And essentially, there were a large numbers of advocates and detractors within the university setting, particularly amongst university leadership. There was a sense that that the academic years had been completed successfully, that we were able to harness big data for a lot of what we wanted to find, that through tracking electronically, you could see that students were present, undertaking assignments and examinations, and eventually completing the year. So interestingly, although there came under a lot of criticism, there was quite a lot of sort of muted celebration from the university leadership about what the moment was bringing. On the other hand, there was a lot of detraction and a lot of detractors from this one scenario. And the big issues that those who detracted brought forward was the issues of access and equity and social justice, and argued whether, in fact, a lot of the structural inequalities that we face in our society were not enhanced and exacerbated during the COVID-19 and crisis moments. Others questioned the issue of qualifications, and there seemed to be a move towards greater shorter qualifications, short learning programs, modularization, and some of our colleagues who wrote about it referred to this as the Uberization of the university, or others questioned, was this not actually the way forward? There was a lot of, again, positive and negative focus on how institutional structures, management, and governance had managed this moment. In South Africa, universities entered into agreements with cell phone companies, managed to get students free data or provide free data for them, delivered laptops and iPads to far rural areas. But again, there's a huge debate and a sense of real concern, and I'm about to complete a special issue on this. There was a sense that the new techno-rational turn within our institutions was actually presenting a moment which we had to look at and analyze quite carefully. Otherwise, we face the danger of using technology, but not in the interests of the majority of students, and in particular of poor and working class students. So again, the 4IR and technology, was it an opportunity or a threat? And again, the debates around technology and curriculum change continued to be high up on the agenda. The issue of curriculum came up and again and again, because in order to continue with teaching and learning during COVID-19, you had to reduce the curriculum, make it more assessment friendly. You had to remove aspects that didn't seem to work on a technological platform. And there was real concern that we were dumbing down the curriculum and that we were teaching to the test. So I think the big issues continue to be that the shift to hybrid forms of learning is paradoxical, as it can be seen both widening and limiting access. It creates social exclusion and severely dents the social justice agenda. And there was a big issues about resource allocation. You can imagine in a developing country like South Africa, that's even more relevant, is what are the enabling infrastructure and resources that are required, that we cannot just be, it cannot be just within institutions, but we need countrywide resourcing. And I think that's a specific reference to things like bandwidth and other sorts of issues, which I'm sure you take somewhat for granted in Australia. So there was a discussion that pedagogies need to be located within these massive shifts, as we all began to feel extremely uncomfortable, some reassurance at some moments, but in some ways unease about how things were moving ahead. And then there was the whole continuum across teaching, learning, curriculum, and a view that this cannot be separated. So I think my own work and research is both in teaching and learning, but also in education funding and equity and resourcing. And what was absolutely clear that it was not looking at individual institutions, but at a system-wide level, we needed to change how things are allocated, and we need to strengthen our infrastructure, both in institutions and in the country. And just to say, in other research that I've been doing recently, there is a big debate going on that in favor of giving individual allocations to students in the form of fees, we are at the same time reducing, cutting back on things like teaching and learning grants, infrastructure grants to universities. The other was, how do we move between, how do we ready ourselves to deliver quality innovation, 21st higher education? And I think all of this, we also had to consider how we are both agile, nimble, and responsive. And I'm not sure what it's like in Australia, excuse me. But in South Africa, and in our own university, procurement processes can be incredibly slow, and everything takes a long time for decisions to be made around change. So there was also in South Africa, there are huge debates going on around decolonization, epistemologies, around new epistemology. And these were very much on the agenda as well, that while we continue to work towards online platforms, we needed to ensure that the big debates that continue to face us as a decolonizing country continue to be on the agenda. So the big issues continue to be resourcing, funding, curriculum reform, the continuing polarization and divides in our society between the haves and the have-nots. The UJ, the university that I'm at, is very focused on 4IR, and is a big advocate of 4IR. How does that play out in the new scenario? And there was also a sense that there was some fatigue around policy and plans. There also continues to be a discussion about the role of private providers and what role they could play in going forward. So at that moment, and I think that moment to think through the major pedagogical issues, we were in an unnatural moment. Change strategies are in place, and as we speak, we continue to be sort of in a hybrid moment, because pandemic and its course has had long-term currently. So let's talk about being put on the back burner. Have we managed to look at the issue of hybridization, online learning, new modalities of delivery? Has that sort of lessened on the agenda, considering we are now particularly at UJ, at the University I'm at, the University of Johannesburg, fully online. So there were lots of issues. The one was around disciplinary difference, and the COVID. A lot of it requires you to be present, and how do we manage that in a hybrid situation? There was a lot of concern about the curriculum and how that was carved into smaller chunks of knowledge, and what this had in terms of teaching and learning and on coherence. There was also about whether, in fact, you can do that to the curriculum. Can you segment knowledge in that way? And then at a societal and a South Africa-wide level, there is limited bandwidth, particularly in rural and poorer and disadvantaged areas. And there was a lot of discussion about these restrictions and whether that would preclude delivery of curriculum. And so there's a lot of curriculum issues. Do we need to have a leaner curriculum? The other views were that teaching and learning is not only about knowledge, but skills and competencies and graduate attributes. So I think the big issues continue to face, and I think it's particularly relevant in this post-COVID moment, is how do we reshape spaces of teaching and learning for them to be effective? How do we teach for a future that in some ways can be unknown? Have skills and generic skills become an academic cul-de-sac? And then I want to sort of begin to conclude with a quote from Ronald Barnett, who says that the way forward lies in constructing and enacting a pedagogy for human being with a focus on human qualities, dispositions, and not solely on knowledge and skills. So finally, I'm not sure what it was like in Australia. I have read some of the research that has come out of here, but there was a lot of anxiety amongst academics about what this new moment will bring. There was a lot of academic fatigue. There was a lot of academic anxieties. There were a lot of academic mental health issues. But there was a view that academics' role was changing, and whether there was a readiness on their part to learn new technologies, make choices about what goes into curriculum, look at assessment to ensure its integrity. There was also a lot of discussion, and we had a sort of set of focus groups which led to some of these observations about how modules, in fact, the way we deliver them, do continue to overlap. And there was a sense that while it was a moment of deep learning and deep sets of some new energy, academics did feel very overloaded. And the sense was also that there needed to be a lot more collaboration and cooperation amongst academics. I think beyond curriculum content, there was a strong focus on what was the purpose of what we were teaching, what were the skills and competencies required, and how could these be developed on the learning management system, given all the limitations that we've discussed. And I think the big question continued to be that is academic, or the role of academics as we've always understood them, under threat? So the focus in the last, in this next period has been on what we learned during the pandemic, what types of new learnings, new waves of learning have entered our institution, and how do we consider a world which is largely going to be managed through issues of big data, through techno-rational approaches, through management buying into some of these approaches, and how do we ensure that it's an era which provides both promise and less peril. Finally, I think this is almost my last slide, sorry. So I think that the big issue is that that where we are at the moment is that we are being challenged about the binaries between the old and the new normal, with thoughts about how COVID-19 did create an opportunity to critically interrogate the epistemological, but also the ethical foundations about what, for many, many years, we presumed as normal. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Shireen. It was really insightful and interesting to think about the similarities and differences between Australia and South Africa. So I'll open the floor for questions.
Hi, Shireen, Maria. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And there are lots of, I guess, similarities and shared experiences here in Australia with what you described there. I currently have a PhD student who's looking at post-COVID and how that's affected the marketing of universities and how much that reflects the actual environments that we have, where we're mostly teaching in a hybrid form or completely online. You mentioned in there about hybrid forms being paradoxical. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
I think maybe to put it a bit in context, I think the sense is that there are, with the whole issue of technology and teaching and learning, that there are both benefits and downsides to it. And I think particularly at UJ, which is a university which had large numbers of working class students, we are moving much more to face-to-face rather than hybrid. But in some of the high levels, for example, at the graduate levels, there is some online or some hybridity involved. So I think it's a fairly simple point to say that the technology both brings benefits and lessons that we can learn from. Hybridity has not always been as successful as we would like, particularly when there are students in the classroom and students who are online, who are experiencing the teaching and learning moment in very different ways. So maybe paradoxical was not quite the right word, but to say that we need to be very mindful as educators about the possibilities and the limits of hybrid teaching and learning. I think there was a sense that a lot of academics have embraced the new ways of teaching and learning in quite an uncritical way. Or was it just about putting your PowerPoint onto online and using that modality in terms of teaching and learning? I think given where we are at, I know at my own university,